The morning was unnaturally still, as though the earth itself had chosen to hold its breath. In the distance, a faint mist clung low to the ground, curling over the grass like restless spirits waiting for the day's offering. Two men stood apart from one another, their figures etched in shadow against the dim glow of dawn. Around them stretched a clearing, unremarkable in size or grandeur, yet destined to be remembered as a place where blood and honor collided with unforgiving force. This was not war. There were no armies clashing, no banners waving, no thunder of marching feet. This was something quieter, more intimate, yet infinitely more haunting, a duel. And unlike the battles that swallowed entire nations, this confrontation was distilled to its purest, most terrible form, two lives balanced upon the edge of steel, with pride as the only reward and death as the likely price. The world has always been fascinated by duels. They are at once ritual and savagery, a performance of civility wrapped around raw violence. For centuries, across cultures, duels have been the stage upon which men attempted to prove their worth, settle grudges, and preserve reputations that often mattered more than life itself. They were not battles fought for territory or crowns, but for something even less tangible, honor. Yet for those who entered the arena of a duel, honor was not abstract. It was everything, the fragile thread that tied a man to his place in society, to his peers, to his legacy. On this particular morning, the weight of centuries pressed upon the shoulders of the two figures who now faced each other. Each carried not only a weapon but also the burden of expectation, the gaze of witnesses, and the knowledge that this would not be a contest of skill alone. No matter the rules or rituals that govern the meeting, once the blades were drawn or the pistols raised, control would slip away. The duel would demand its price, and it would not be satisfied with mere scratches or polite gestures. The silence of the arena was deceptive. Around its edges, hidden beyond the mist, there were voices, low, murmuring, restless. Gentlemen, nobles, soldiers, and common folk alike had gathered, drawn to the terrible beauty of what was about to unfold. Their whispers carried a nervous energy, for each knew they were about to witness a spectacle that might haunt them for the rest of their lives. To some, this was entertainment, a blood-soaked drama to be retold in taverns and halls. To others, it was a solemn matter of justice, a test of courage and divine judgment. For the duelists themselves, it was far simpler: survive or fall. What makes this duel stand apart, what marks it as the bloodiest ever recorded, is not merely the violence that followed, but the sheer intensity with which the struggle consumed its participants. It was more than a quarrel resolved with measured strokes. It was a descent into chaos, a grim dance where pride and fury overwhelmed restraint. Blow after blow, strike after strike, the combat refused to end when most duels would have collapsed into exhaustion or concession. Instead, it spiraled into something primal, something that stripped away the veneer of civility and revealed the raw brutality beneath. But before we arrive at that storm, we linger in this fragile calm. The air is cold. The breath of each man leaves a ghostly cloud that drifts upward and vanishes, as fleeting as life itself. Their hands tighten around the hilts or grips of their chosen weapons, not yet raised but alive with anticipation. They have rehearsed this moment in their minds countless times, imagining the strike that will bring glory or the mistake that will bring death. And though their faces remain still, betraying little to the crowd, inside their hearts thunder with the same fear that has haunted duelists since the first challenge was ever issued. There is a strange paradox in this moment, one that history has preserved across countless confrontations. On one hand, the duel is framed by order, agreed upon rules, measured distances, seconds to oversee fairness, and a veneer of legality or ritual. On the other hand, beneath that order lies pure chaos, for no rule can dictate the path of a blade once it arcs through the air, or the way a man might stumble, recover, or press forward with desperation. The structure is there to give the illusion of control, but all who have witnessed a duel know the truth: once it begins, nothing can be controlled. The duelists exchange a final look, one that carries the weight of their feud, their pride, their refusal to yield. In that gaze is the essence of human conflict: rage tempered by fear, respect mingled with loathing. For one, this may be the last sunrise he ever sees. For the other, survival may bring no joy, only the hollow echo of victory purchased too dearly. Yet both step forward, because to turn away is unthinkable. A man who refuses a duel is branded a coward, and in a world where honor outweighs even breath, cowardice is a death more permanent than the blade. The seconds, appointed guardians of ritual, glance toward the sky as if to mark the hour. Their voices cut through the silence, announcing the terms, the readiness, the signal. It is strange how calm their words sound, as though they were describing a game or a dance, rather than the threshold of mortality. The crowd shifts, leaning forward, eyes wide, hearts pounding in unison with the men who now stand at the edge of eternity. This is the threshold moment, the point where imagination gives way to reality, where possibility hardens into fate. Soon, steel will flash, blood will spill, and cries will fill the air. But for now, for this fleeting heartbeat of silence, time seems suspended. It is the calm before the storm, a fragile stillness that history always remembers as the prelude to violence. And so, the scene is set. A field veiled in mist. Two men bound by pride. A crowd hungry for resolution. Rules that promise fairness but guarantee nothing. And hovering over all of it, the shadow of history itself, waiting to record every cut, every scream, every drop of blood that will soon be shed. This is not merely a duel, it is the bloodiest duel ever to scar the pages of time, and it begins with silence, broken only by the sound of breath. Across the span of human history, violence has worn many faces. Wars were waged for land, for gold, for crowns and empires. Yet among all the organized bloodshed, one peculiar ritual endures in memory with a strange fascination: the duel. Unlike the vast clash of armies, a duel was stripped bare, narrowed down to two individuals, standing opposite each other, prepared to risk everything over matters that, by modern standards, might seem trivial. And yet, in their world, in their time, nothing was more important. Honor was the invisible currency of life, and when honor was challenged, blood was the price demanded. The duel was not a singular invention of one culture. It appeared like a shadow across the histories of many civilizations, each shaping it according to their own codes and customs. In ancient Rome, though formal duels were not yet defined, gladiators fought for spectacle, their deaths not only entertainment but demonstrations of discipline, bravery, and endurance. To the Roman elite, such combat reflected the ideals of strength and the ability to face death with dignity. It was not yet about personal honor in the sense later centuries would understand, but the seeds of ritualized combat were planted there, in arenas filled with cheers and cries. In medieval Europe, the concept evolved into the trial by combat, where disputes were not settled by mere words or judgments but by combat under the watchful eye of God. If one man prevailed, it was taken as a divine decision, proof that righteousness favored the victor. These encounters were often brutal, with knights or commoners alike donning armor and wielding heavy weapons, smashing against one another until one could fight no more. Justice, in that world, was measured not only in law but in strength. The duel, therefore, became not just a method of resolving disputes, but an act of faith, an appeal to heaven to witness and decide. As the centuries passed, the duel transformed again, this time with a refinement that mirrored the rise of aristocracy and the cultivation of chivalric ideals. Among knights, duels became a matter of reputation, an arena in which courage, skill, and loyalty could be displayed. Codes of chivalry dictated the conduct of warriors, but when those codes were breached, when insults were exchanged, or dishonor suspected, a duel was often the chosen answer. In these moments, a knight's worth was tested not in the chaos of the battlefield but in the focused clarity of personal combat. By the Renaissance, the duel became more formalized, particularly in Europe. Swords, rapiers, elegant and deadly, replaced the heavy axes and maces of earlier centuries. The art of fencing developed not merely as a means of self-defense but as a cultural expression of grace and discipline. Manuals were written, teaching not only techniques of thrust and parry but also the philosophy of honor. To wound was one thing, but to prove one's courage in the ritualized framework of a duel was what mattered most. It was not uncommon for nobles to risk their lives over words whispered in courtly halls, glances exchanged at feasts, or accusations of betrayal whispered in the dark. What strikes the modern mind as excessive was, in their world, the very essence of dignity. A man without honor was no man at all, no matter how wealthy or titled he might be. Honor was reputation, reputation was respect, And respect was survival in societies where power rested on fragile human networks. An insult unchecked could ruin a man's career, unravel his alliances, and cast suspicion on his loyalty. And so, when words failed, when apologies were insufficient, the duel became the final court of appeal. In other parts of the world, similar traditions emerged, though under different names and customs. In Japan, the samurai class adhered to Bushido, the way of the warrior, where duels, often with swords, were not only common but seen as tests of character. A samurai who dishonored himself could restore his reputation through combat, or, failing that, through ritual suicide, proving that the preservation of honor outweighed even the preservation of life. In many cultures, across continents, the same truth echoed. Honor was fragile, honor was absolute, and honor demanded a willingness to die. The duel, then, was more than violence. It was performance, a stage upon which the values of society were played out. There was ceremony in the way the ground was chosen, in the roles of seconds who oversaw fairness, in the precise language of challenge and acceptance. Even the weapons spoke volumes, swords for elegance, pistols for cold finality. The audience, whether small or vast, knew they were not simply witnessing bloodshed but watching the invisible rules of their world enforced. And yet, beneath the elegance and ritual, the duel was always a paradox. It dressed itself in civility, in rules and courtesies, but at its heart it remained an act of destruction. Two lives, reduced to one victor and one victim, all because words, pride, or suspicion demanded resolution in the most absolute form. The calm language of honor masked the chaos of violence, but the result was the same: blood spilled upon the ground to satisfy society's demand for dignity preserved. Consider how different this is from the modern world, where disputes are taken to courts, where insults are met with words, where reputation is defended through law or reputation management. In the past, such avenues would have been considered hollow, insufficient, even cowardly. The duel was the truest form of judgment because it placed everything upon the line. A man unwilling to risk death for his words was a man unworthy of them. Thus, duels became woven into the very fabric of life for centuries, stretching from the cobblestone streets of European capitals to the quiet courtyards of Eastern temples, to frontier towns where pistols flashed at high noon. This culture of dueling is essential to understand, for without it, the duel we are about to witness, the bloodiest ever recorded, would appear meaningless, a senseless slaughter. But in its time, it was not meaningless at all. It was the logical, if terrible, consequence of the world's values. Two men standing with weapons drawn were not anomalies but products of their society, shaped by traditions that insisted reputation was worth more than breath itself. It is in this context, in this world where honor ruled with an iron hand, that our duel takes place. And once we understand the depth of that culture, the weight pressing on those who fought, we can see clearly why they stepped forward rather than walked away, why blood was spilled until history itself recoiled at the sight. Every great storm begins with a single spark, a small and often overlooked moment that sets into motion forces too vast to be contained. The bloodiest duel in history was no different. To understand how two men came to stand across from one another, ready to fight to the death, we must travel back into the world of their rivalry, a world where pride was sharp as steel, where envy and suspicion grew unchecked, and where even the smallest insult could ignite a firestorm of violence. It began not on the battlefield or in a royal court, but in the more subtle arenas of everyday life: whispered words, private grievances, and unspoken resentments. These men were not strangers thrown together by accident. They were bound by circumstance, perhaps even by destiny, their paths colliding in ways that would leave neither unchanged. Both were figures of status, respected in their circles, yet constantly measured against each other. In societies where reputation was fragile, comparison was dangerous. And comparison between these two men was inevitable. The first seeds of conflict were sown in rivalry. Each sought recognition, honor, and influence. When one rose, the other felt diminished. When one was praised, the other burned with quiet resentment. Such rivalries are common in human history, but what made this one so combustible was that neither man could afford to yield. In their world, to acknowledge the superiority of the other was to invite weakness, and weakness was a scent that predators, both political and personal, would quickly exploit. Thus, every triumph of one became an insult to the other, every failure became fuel for mockery. Over time, slights accumulated like dry tinder. Perhaps one man made a cutting remark at a feast, a remark that drew laughter from the crowd. Perhaps another claimed a victory, whether in battle, politics, or love, that the other could not match. Pride is not measured in grand betrayals alone. Often it bleeds slowly, drip by drip, through the constant pressure of comparison and humiliation. And for men raised in cultures where honor was absolute, these small wounds did not heal. They festered. Rumors too played their part, as they always do. Whispers in corridors, notes passed in secret, confidences betrayed. It is said that one of the men accused the other of treachery, perhaps of betrayal in a political alliance or even in matters of the heart. Was the accusation true? History offers no certain answer, and in some ways, it does not matter. What matters is that the charge struck at the very core of reputation. To be accused was to be stained. To remain silent was to admit guilt. The only cure for such a wound was combat, for only blood could wash away dishonor. The escalation was slow at first. Challenges were exchanged not with steel but with words, heated arguments, public confrontations, veiled threats. Each time, there was an opportunity for peace, for retreat, for compromise. And each time, pride stood in the way. For men bound by the iron cage of reputation, to step back even once was to accept defeat forever. The pressure of onlookers, friends, and rivals demanded escalation, not resolution. The duel was not yet inevitable, but with each passing moment it drew nearer, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Consider the role of society in this spiral. It was not only the duelists who drove events forward, but the culture that surrounded them. Those who stood by, friends, allies, enemies, and strangers, fueled the fire with their expectations. When one man was insulted, others whispered that he must respond. When one's honor was questioned, others suggested that silence would mark him as cowardly. The duel was not just a private quarrel, it was a stage performance, compelled as much by the audience as by the actors. Pride is heavy when carried alone, but unbearable when carried under the watchful gaze of society. And so, what might have remained a private enmity began to swell into something larger. The men could no longer resolve their quarrel in shadows or whispers. Their dispute had grown too large, too public, too poisonous. Each saw the other not just as an opponent, but as a threat to everything he held dear, his name, his honor, his legacy. Insults had piled upon insults until the weight was too much to bear. Something had to give, and in their world, only one resolution was possible. The challenge was issued at last. We do not know the exact words spoken, but we can imagine them, sharp and cold as steel itself. One man, his voice steady but burning with rage, accused the other directly, perhaps in public, so that all who listened would know the seriousness of his claim. The other, equally proud, refused to yield. He met the words with acceptance, and the stage was set. The duel was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. The choice of weapons was made, the location agreed upon, the seconds appointed. The machinery of ritual began to turn. Yet beneath the calm formality of preparation, there was fury and desperation. These men had no desire for peace. Each wanted not merely to win but to destroy, to erase the insult not only with victory but with the blood of his enemies staining the ground. What makes this conflict especially haunting is how avoidable it might have been. A single concession, a single apology, even the smallest gesture of humility might have diffused the tension. But in their world, humility was death of another kind. And so they marched forward, step by inevitable step, toward the field where destiny awaited them. In hindsight, the spark that lit this fire may seem insignificant. A rumor, a slight, a rivalry that could not be contained. But history is filled with such sparks, small moments that ignite great conflagrations. Empires have fallen because of insults. Nations have gone to war because of words. And here, two men would tear each other apart because pride demanded it, because neither could bend without breaking. The seeds of conflict had been sown long before the duel itself, watered by resentment, fed by whispers, and hardened by pride. By the time the challenge was spoken aloud, the duel was already written in their fates. The storm had broken free of its spark, and nothing, Not reason, not law, not friendship, could hold it back. The bloodiest duel in history was not born in a single moment, but in countless small choices, each one narrowing the path until only violence remained. And so, as we turn to the next chapter, the picture sharpens. We have seen the spark, the seeds of conflict. Now we must come closer, to see the men themselves, their faces, their lives, their humanity. For it is only when we understand who they were that we can fully grasp what it meant for them to step into the arena, where words ended and steel began. To truly grasp the meaning of the bloodiest duel in history, we must first pause and look closely at the men who stood at its center. Too often history records only their actions, the clash, the outcome, the blood spilled, while forgetting that before they became opponents, they were human beings. They were not faceless names in a chronicle but men of flesh and blood, with lives shaped by family, ambition, fear, and pride. To see them clearly is to understand why they fought with such fury, why neither could yield, and why the duel ended as it did. The first duelist, let us call him the challenger, was a man forged in discipline. Born into a family that valued honor as an heirloom passed down through generations, he was raised with the constant reminder that his life was not his alone. His father, a stern figure of authority, often reminded him that every action reflected not just upon himself but upon his ancestors. As a boy, he trained with weapons before he learned to write. By the time he reached manhood, he had mastered the rapier, the longsword, and the pistol, each weapon becoming an extension of his pride. To outsiders, he seemed the embodiment of composure, his movements precise, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. Yet beneath that carefully cultivated exterior lay a soul restless with ambition and haunted by the fear of inadequacy. He was not a man content with mediocrity. Every room he entered, he sought to dominate. Every conversation was an opportunity to prove wit, every gathering a chance to display refinement. To him, life was a duel of another kind, one waged with words, gestures, and presence. When rivals challenged him socially, he met them with charm laced with barbs. When whispers questioned his loyalty, he answered with demonstrations of courage. And when insult crossed the invisible line into dishonor, he responded with steel. For him, pride was not a luxury but a shield. Without it, he believed himself nothing. The second duelist, the one who accepted the challenge, was of a different mold. He was not born into nobility but clawed his way upward through merit, determination, and no small measure of daring. Where his rival was polished and disciplined, he was raw, passionate, and fierce. His youth had been spent in hardship, his days marked by labor, his nights by study and practice. He learned the sword not in halls of training but in the dirt of courtyards, where mistakes were paid in bruises and scars. His rise was fueled not by inheritance but by relentless effort, and in that rise, he developed a pride even sharper than that of the man born into status. For him, honor was proof of worth, the validation that he belonged among men who once looked down upon him. Every insult was not merely a personal wound but a reminder of where he came from, a reminder of how fragile his place in the world remained. He could not afford to yield because yielding would confirm what his enemies whispered, that he was unworthy of the respect he demanded. His pride was not only for himself but for every step he had taken out of obscurity. To fight was to defend the life he had built. To lose would be to see it collapse. Physically, they could not have been more different. The challenger, lean and sharp, carried himself with the precision of a duelist trained in academies. His strength lay in his calculation, his ability to read movements, to strike not with brute force but with flawless timing. The other, broader of shoulder, moved with the raw power of someone who had learned to fight in chaos. His strikes carried the weight of experience, his body hardened by the struggles of survival. One fought like a surgeon, cutting clean and exact. The other fought like a storm, overwhelming with ferocity. Yet what united them was the same burning core, pride. Each man saw himself as the embodiment of honor, the guardian of dignity. Each looked upon the other not merely as a rival but as a threat to his very existence. For pride, once wounded, is not easily mended. And in their case, the wounds had been festering for far too long. Around them, society watched with fascination. The challenger represented the old order, the traditions of lineage, the polished ideals of honor handed down through centuries. His opponent embodied the rising men of merit who earned their place with sweat and steel rather than inheritance. Their conflict, then, was not merely personal but symbolic, a collision between worlds. When they faced each other, it was as if history itself leaned forward to watch which vision of manhood would prevail. The men themselves were not blind to this symbolism. Each understood that the duel would be remembered. Each knew that his actions would echo beyond his own life. To the challenger, victory would prove that bloodlines and traditions still held power. To his rival, victory would declare that merit and strength could triumph over privilege. Neither could surrender such a cause, for to do so was to surrender not just personal pride but everything they represented. And yet, for all their pride, for all the roles they played, they were still human. On the eve of the duel, each man sat alone, grappling with the quiet weight of mortality. The challenger, in his chamber, traced his finger over the hilt of his rapier, the same weapon that had served him countless times. His thoughts wandered to his family name, to the expectations resting on his shoulders. He knew he could not fail them. His heart beat fast, but his face remained calm, practiced in stillness. He prayed silently, not for mercy, but for strength. His opponent, meanwhile, sat in the dim glow of a single candle, sharpening his blade. He remembered his youth, the long nights of struggle, the laughter of those who once mocked him. His hands bore scars of labor, his body marked by battles survived. To him, this duel was more than a matter of pride, it was destiny, the culmination of every step that had carried him from obscurity to recognition. He whispered no prayers, for he trusted only in his own strength. His faith was not in heaven but in his arm, his endurance, his fury. When dawn came, and both men stepped onto the field, they were more than individuals. They were symbols, champions of their worlds, each carrying not only his own pride but the weight of history's judgment. Yet strip away the grandeur, and they remained simply men, two hearts beating, two minds racing, two souls trapped in the same iron cage of honor that demanded blood. It is easy, centuries later, to see them only as adversaries locked in inevitable conflict. But in that moment, they were also fragile, vulnerable. Beneath the armor of pride, there was fear, fear of death, fear of humiliation, fear of being forgotten. And it was that fear, more than anything else, that fueled their fury. For pride, when mixed with fear, becomes a fire that cannot be extinguished except by violence. Thus, when they finally raised their weapons, they did so not as strangers but as men whose lives had been intertwined by rivalry, resentment, and pride. Their profiles tell us this truth: the duel was never about a single insult or a single moment of anger. It was about everything they were, everything they had built, and everything they refused to lose. And because of that, the battle ahead would not be measured in precision or restraint, but in the blood that would stain the earth until neither man could fight any longer. The duel was not merely a clash of two men, it was a spectacle staged before the eyes of a society both fascinated and horrified by the theater of honor. To understand the weight of the moment, we must lift our gaze from the narrow circle of the duelists themselves and see the wider world that surrounded them, the court, the common folk, the chroniclers, and the silent laws of culture that gave meaning to the spilling of blood. In the still morning air, as the two men prepared to meet, there was more than the scent of fear and steel, there was also the unshakable knowledge that an audience waited, that eyes of every rank and every corner of society were fixed upon them. From the highest echelons of nobility, men and women gathered, their silken garments rustling as they murmured behind gloved hands. For them, the duel was both entertainment and validation. In a world where power and status often felt abstract, here was something visceral, two men willing to die for pride, for honor, for their place in the hierarchy. Some saw it as proof that noble values still held sway, that honor was not just a word to be spoken in ballrooms but a reality to be defended with blood. Others, however, saw it as barbaric, an echo of a past the world should have outgrown. Yet even those who condemned it could not look away. The duel compelled attention, for it spoke to something primal within the human soul, the fascination with life and death, with courage tested to its breaking point. Among the common folk, the duel spread like wildfire in rumor and song. Tavern keepers whispered of it over mugs of ale, merchants speculated about who would win and how, children imitated sword fights in the dirt, shouting the names of the duelists as if they were knights of legend. For those who toiled daily with little chance of rising above their station, the duel was a rare glimpse of drama among the powerful. It was proof that even men of rank could be dragged into mortal peril, that beneath their silks and titles they too bled red. Some even cheered for the man of humble origins, the one who had risen by merit, seeing in him a reflection of their own struggle. Others supported the challenger of noble blood, for he represented stability, tradition, and the belief that some values should remain unchanged. The clergy watched with conflicted hearts. To them, dueling was a sin, an act of arrogance in which men placed their pride above God's law. Priests preached against it from pulpits, warning that those who shed blood for vanity risked their souls. Yet, in secret, even the clergy felt the pull of fascination. They could not deny that duels carried a strange gravity, that men who fought under the banner of honor seemed almost larger than life. Some whispered that God himself might favor the victor, as though divine judgment were rendered through the clash of steel. It was a dangerous thought, but one difficult to silence in an age when fate and faith were so deeply entwined. The chroniclers, the scribes of history, sharpened their quills. They knew that this duel, unlike so many forgotten skirmishes, would be remembered. It was not just the blood of two men, but the blood of symbols, old order against new, privilege against merit, tradition against change. They prepared to inscribe not just the outcome but the meaning, to frame the duel in words that would echo for centuries. And in doing so, they elevated the moment from personal conflict to legend. The duelists themselves may have felt trapped by circumstance, but society saw them as actors in a grand narrative, unwilling or unable to step off the stage. It is worth pausing to consider how such duels became spectacles at all. In theory, a duel was private, an affair of honor between two men. Yet in practice, society intruded, drawn irresistibly to the drama. Onlookers gathered not only out of curiosity but because the duel touched upon their own values. Honor was not a private possession but a public currency. A man's worth was measured by how others perceived him. To restore honor, therefore, required witnesses. Without an audience, the duel lost its meaning. And so, as the two men prepared to risk everything, the presence of society was not incidental but essential. They fought not only for themselves but for the judgment of those who watched. The atmosphere of the crowd was tense, almost electric. Silence fell as the duelists approached, broken only by the shuffle of boots and the creak of leather. Faces leaned forward, eyes wide, breaths held. Some prayed quietly, their lips moving in desperate hope. Others whispered wagers, turning the blood of men into sport. Still others looked on with detached curiosity, as though they were scholars observing an experiment. Yet beneath these varied reactions lay a single unifying truth: no one was indifferent. The duel demanded attention, demanded emotion. To watch was to be changed, for whether the outcome brought joy, sorrow, or horror, it revealed the fragile thread by which life and honor hung. The duel also revealed society's contradictions. Those who condemned violence still flocked to see it. Those who denounced pride secretly admired its ferocity. Those who lived humbly felt a thrill in watching the great brought low. And those who lived in luxury felt relief in seeing their values defended. The duel became a mirror, reflecting back the desires and fears of every stratum of society. In that mirror, people saw courage they lacked, rage they repressed, dignity they longed for. They projected their own struggles onto the duelists, making the fight both personal and universal. Even those absent from the field were caught in its grip. News spread like wildfire, carried by word of mouth, by letters, by gossip whispered in markets and halls. The story grew in the telling, each retelling adding color and drama. By the time the duel was over, it was already legend. Those who had not seen it claimed they had, describing details they could not possibly know. In this way, society itself became a storyteller, shaping the duel into myth before the blood had dried. And so, as the blades were drawn and the duel began, the two men were not alone. They were surrounded by the weight of countless eyes, the murmur of countless voices, the judgment of countless hearts. They carried upon their shoulders not just their own pride but the expectations of a world eager to watch, to judge, to remember. The duel was no longer theirs, it belonged to everyone. And that truth, perhaps more than any thrust or strike, ensured that what followed would be remembered as one of the bloodiest, most infamous duels in history. Long before the first strike rang out across the field, the duel was already unfolding through a series of rituals as old as honor itself. To modern eyes, these preparations may seem strange, even theatrical, but in the world of the duelists they carried immense meaning. They were the careful weaving of a tapestry, a sequence of gestures and formalities that elevated the fight from a mere brawl to a sacred trial of justice and pride. Without these rituals, the clash would have been nothing more than bloodshed. With them, it became something larger, a ceremony in which men entrusted their lives to custom, to steel, and perhaps even to fate. At first light, the appointed field lay quiet, heavy with anticipation. The ground was chosen with care, flat, open, and visible, so that no one might later claim advantage was unfairly gained. In many duels, such spaces were cleared of stones or debris, as though the earth itself were being prepared for sacrifice. On this day, the field resembled a stage, empty yet waiting, its silence almost oppressive. Every shadow, every whisper of wind seemed to hold its breath for the violence to come. Then came the seconds, the chosen companions of each duelist. Their role was both practical and symbolic. They were guardians of fairness, arbiters of honor, witnesses who ensured that no deceit stained the proceedings. More than that, they were voices of last appeal. Even at this late hour, the seconds could urge reconciliation, could beg the duelists to lay aside their swords. And sometimes, though rarely, such pleas succeeded. But on this day, pride was too heavy, wounds too deep. The seconds themselves likely knew that peace was already impossible. Still, their presence gave structure, legitimacy, and the weight of ritual to what was about to unfold. The weapons were then brought forth, gleaming in the pale light. Swords, polished until they caught the dawn like fire, were presented for examination. Each blade was inspected carefully by the opposing side, ensuring no hidden trickery lay concealed in the steel. Balance was tested, edges studied, hilts weighed in the palm. There could be no question of unfairness, for the slightest dishonor would taint the entire duel. Once both sides were satisfied, the weapons were returned to their rightful owners, now transformed from simple tools into instruments of destiny. Clothing too carried meaning. Duelists often stripped away ornament, donning plain garments so that freedom of movement was assured and so that no one might later say victory had been aided by armor disguised as fashion. Yet even in simplicity, pride showed itself. A man's bearing, the tilt of his chin, the firmness of his grip, all these spoke to his courage. Every eye watched closely, for in these subtle details lay the measure of the soul. Then came the invocation of rules. Whether spoken aloud by seconds or agreed upon in silence, these were the boundaries of combat. Would it be fought until first blood, until one could no longer stand, or until death itself? In this duel, nothing less than death would suffice. The grievance was too severe, the wound too deep. To stop short of killing would leave the matter unresolved, and neither man could endure such uncertainty. The rules declared, both duelists nodded, not as men agreeing to a game, but as warriors surrendering themselves to a code older than either of them. In some traditions, prayers were spoken. A priest might murmur a blessing, invoking divine witness upon the combat, though in other places the church condemned duels outright. Yet even without official prayers, many duelists crossed themselves, whispered invocations to God, or clutched small talismans of faith. It is one of history's great contradictions, that men who placed their lives in God's hands would also grasp swords to spill the blood of their brothers. But such is the human heart, ever torn between faith and pride. The crowd, too, had its place in the ritual. Murmurs fell silent as the preparations unfolded. No one dared break the sacred stillness, for to interrupt was to risk dishonoring the duel. Every eye followed each motion, from the unsheathing of swords to the final tightening of grips. The air grew heavy, so still it seemed the earth itself leaned in to watch. Men and women felt their own hearts quicken, as though their breath was linked to the duelists. In that moment, the boundary between participants and spectators blurred. All were bound by the same tension, the same inexorable pull toward violence. And then, finally, the duelists stepped forward. Each man took his place upon the field, feet planted firmly, shoulders squared. The distance between them was measured precisely. Too close, and the fight might begin before both were ready. Too far, and hesitation might creep in. The exact spacing was itself a ritual, a physical boundary that symbolized the fairness of the trial. Neither man spoke, their silence was louder than any words. Eyes locked, unblinking, they measured not just the ground but each other's souls. Seconds gave the signal. Perhaps a hand was raised, perhaps a word was spoken, sharp and clear in the morning air. And in that instant, all preparation ended. The rituals had served their purpose. They had guided the men to this threshold, ensured that the duel would be fought not as chaos but as order, not as crime but as ceremony. The rest would be left to steel, to skill, to courage, and to fate. Looking back, one sees how deeply these rituals mattered. Without them, the duel would have been nothing but murder. With them, it became a trial of honor, one that society accepted, even revered, as a necessary burden of pride. The swords were sharp, the ground was ready, and the eyes of the world were fixed upon the combatants. Every formality, every gesture, every silent rule had carried the duelists here, to the edge of life and death. In the hush before the first clash, there was a strange beauty. For all the rage and bitterness that had brought them here, for all the death that was about to unfold, there was also dignity. Two men, bound by custom, by honor, by the iron weight of ritual, now stood ready to entrust their lives to the judgment of steel. The duel had not yet begun, but already it was more than blood. It was history, alive in its most violent and solemn form. And so, with all preparations complete, the ritual of steel gave way to the reality of combat. The air trembled, the crowd leaned forward, and in the space of a heartbeat, the world shifted. What had been ceremony was about to become slaughter. The moment had come. All the rituals, the whispers, the sharpened blades, the prayers half-spoken under trembling breath, everything had led to this single heartbeat. Two men stood facing one another on the cleared field, steel in their hands, pride in their eyes, and the full weight of their honor pressing upon their shoulders. The silence that stretched between them was almost unbearable, as though time itself hesitated, unwilling to witness the horror about to unfold. Then, with a single signal, the stillness shattered. The duel had begun. At first, there was no wild fury, no reckless lunge. These were not brawlers fueled by rage alone, but warriors schooled in the art of combat. Their movements were measured, cautious, like predators circling one another in the forest. Each step, each twitch of muscle, was deliberate, designed to probe, to test, to read the other's intent. The swords gleamed in the morning light, reflecting flashes of brilliance with every shift of angle. The crowd leaned forward as one, every eye fixed on the narrow strip of ground where life and death now danced together. The opening strikes came like whispers, quick, sharp, exploratory. One man feinted low, testing the reflexes of his enemy, only to find the blade instantly there to meet him. A counter came, swift and precise, but was parried with equal skill. Steel rang against steel, a cold, merciless sound that echoed across the watching throng. Each clash was not merely physical, but psychological, an attempt to unsettle, to force the other into a mistake. The duel was a game of nerves as much as strength, and in these opening moments, neither was willing to yield an inch. The first true attack broke the fragile balance. With a sudden surge, one of the duelists drove forward, his blade cutting through the air with lethal speed. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the strike seemed destined to end it all in a single instant. But his opponent twisted at the last heartbeat, steel sliding against steel with a shriek that pierced the silence. Sparks flew, and the two men closed, faces inches apart, eyes blazing with fury and fear. For a moment they stood locked together, blades grinding, muscles trembling with exertion. Then, with a shove, they broke apart, circling once more. The battle had truly begun. It was in these early exchanges that the duelists revealed themselves not just as warriors, but as men. One fought with a controlled ferocity, every movement tight, efficient, honed like a blade itself. His strikes carried a precision that spoke of discipline, of endless hours spent training until instinct replaced thought. The other fought with equal skill but a different fire. His style was broader, more aggressive, a storm of sweeping blows that sought to overwhelm rather than outmaneuver. Where the first man was like a scalpel, cold and exact, the second was like a hammer, brutal and relentless. Each style reflected the soul of its wielder, and the clash between them was as much about identity as it was about victory. The crowd, though silent in reverence, felt every blow as if it struck their own flesh. Hearts raced, breaths caught, hands clenched. Some closed their eyes, unable to watch the inevitable spilling of blood, while others stared unblinking, unwilling to miss even a heartbeat. The duel had become more than two men on a field. It was theater, ritual, test, and execution all at once. In every clang of steel, in every bead of sweat, the watching world felt the weight of human pride, human rage, and human mortality. And then came the first blood. It was not a fatal wound, not yet, but a shallow cut drawn across the forearm as one blade slipped past a parry. The sight of crimson blossoming against pale skin drew a murmur from the crowd, a collective gasp as though the entire assembly had been wounded together. The injured man did not falter. If anything, the sting of blood seemed to sharpen his resolve, his eyes narrowing, his strikes coming faster, sharper, more desperate. Blood was both a wound and a declaration, proof that the duel was real, that it would not end without sacrifice. The tempo quickened. Where once the duelists had circled cautiously, now they pressed harder, steel flashing in blinding arcs. Feet stamped upon the earth, scuffing dirt into the air, leaving shallow grooves in the soil. Each attack was answered, each defense countered. The field became a blur of motion, a storm of sweat and steel. To the untrained eye, it seemed chaos, but within the chaos lay patterns, rhythms of strike and parry, advance and retreat, the timeless dance of combat honed through centuries. What makes the opening clash so haunting is not merely the violence, but the restraint. Both men knew that a single mistake would cost everything. Every strike carried the weight of death, and yet every defense was as vital as breath. It was a battle of inches, where the slightest hesitation, the smallest miscalculation, would end a life. The opening moments stretched like eternity, each heartbeat echoing louder than the last. The psychological war was just as brutal as the physical. Each man sought to read the other, to see the flicker of doubt, the hesitation of fear. One glared with unyielding intensity, daring his opponent to falter. The other smiled faintly, a mask of confidence meant to unnerve. Words were rare, but eyes spoke volumes: rage, contempt, defiance, desperation. It was as though the blades were not the only weapons, pride itself was wielded like steel, cutting just as deeply. And always, the crowd bore witness. They were the silent chorus to this deadly play, their emotions feeding the duel as surely as sweat and blood. Their presence magnified every motion, every strike, until the duel seemed no longer the act of two men, but of the entire world pressing itself into a single violent instant. The duelists fought not only for themselves but for every eye watching, every voice that would later tell the tale. By the time the opening clash reached its peak, the field was already marked with the evidence of struggle. Sweat dripped from brows, breath came in ragged gasps, and the soil bore the dark stain of blood. Yet neither man slowed, neither yielded. If anything, the first taste of blood drove them harder, deeper into the storm. What began as caution had become fury, what began as restraint had become desperation. The duel had crossed its threshold. There would be no turning back. And so, with the first blood spilled, the true battle loomed ahead. The opening clash had stripped away pretense, revealed the steel at the heart of each man. Pride had spoken, courage had been tested, and now only one truth remained: one would leave the field alive, and the other would be swallowed by history. The duel had begun as ritual, as formality, but it would end as carnage. The world leaned closer, hearts pounding, eyes unblinking. The blades were ready, the flesh was vulnerable, and destiny had already chosen its course. The first clash of steel against steel had been like thunder on the horizon. What followed would be the storm itself. Every duel has its rhythm, its ebb and flow, like the rise and fall of a tide. The opening clash had been thunderous, sharp, a fierce declaration of willpower. But what followed was even more perilous, the moments where the tide shifted, where death itself seemed to hover on the edge of a blade, ready to claim its due. In these turning points, the duel balanced on a knife's edge, and a single breath, a single faltering step, might have been enough to end everything. The first of these moments came in a blur of steel and instinct. One duelist, pressing his advantage after drawing first blood, surged forward with a series of rapid strikes. His blade flickered like lightning, each thrust and slash aimed not at testing but at finishing. The crowd gasped as his opponent staggered backward, forced to give ground, his defenses barely holding. For an instant, it seemed certain the duel would end in that flurry, that the hammering rhythm of blows would overwhelm the man's guard and drive steel into his chest. Yet at the very brink of collapse, he rallied. With a desperate twist, he parried one strike, pivoted his body, and countered with a sudden upward slash that nearly turned defeat into triumph. The aggressor barely avoided the blow, his cheek nicked, a line of red across his skin. Both men froze for half a heartbeat, breathing hard, eyes wide. Death had passed close enough to taste. The second turning point was more subtle, more psychological. Exhaustion had begun to creep in, the weight of armorless bodies fighting with ferocious energy dragging at muscles and lungs. Sweat stung their eyes, hands grew slick on hilts, legs trembled beneath the strain. It was in this exhaustion that doubt whispered, tempting each man with thoughts of surrender, of collapse. The crowd, though silent, felt this shift. They could see it in the heaviness of each motion, in the slower recovery after each strike. One duelist, sensing weakness in his enemy, attempted to press with broader, heavier blows, using brute force to break through. But brute force is a dangerous gamble, it opens as much as it threatens. And so, as his strike came down with the weight of desperation, the other sidestepped, pivoted smoothly, and drove his blade forward in a thrust that came within inches of piercing the heart. The entire field seemed to freeze. Had the blade been a fraction traw, the duel would have ended there. But fate, or perhaps skill, spared the man by a breath. The turning point had passed, leaving behind only terror and renewed fury. The third came in the form of terrain. Though the ground had been cleared, it was still earth, uneven, soft in some places, hard in others. In the midst of the clash, one duelist's foot caught in a shallow groove carved by earlier steps. His balance faltered, his body pitched forward, and in that instant, he was vulnerable. His enemy saw the opening, his blade already arcing down in a killing stroke. The crowd gasped as one, for it seemed inevitable that the duel would end then and there. Yet by some miracle of instinct, the stumbling man rolled with his fall, twisting his body so that the strike whistled just above his shoulder. He came up on one knee, sword raised in defense, alive but shaken. The ground itself had nearly claimed him, and the memory of that near death would haunt him with every step thereafter. But the most chilling turning point of all came when one man's blade at last sank deeper than any had before. A thrust caught flesh, not just skin. A cry rang out, sharp, guttural, half fury, half agony, as blood spilled more freely. The wounded man staggered, his body shuddering with the shock of real injury. For the spectators, time seemed to slow. Was this the end? Would he fall, clutching at the wound, unable to fight on? Yet pride, that cruel and relentless master, refused to let him fall. With teeth clenched and eyes blazing, he pressed his hand against the bleeding gash and raised his sword once more. The pain was immense, the weakness undeniable, but he refused to yield. In that moment, the duel transformed from contest to ordeal, from skill to sheer endurance of suffering. Each turning point drew the crowd deeper into the gravity of the duel. They gasped at near misses, cried out at sudden reversals, whispered fervent prayers when death seemed certain. And always, the duelists themselves carried on, eyes locked, breaths ragged, blades unrelenting. They had passed beyond caution, beyond tactics. Each turning point had stripped away another layer of restraint, leaving behind only raw determination. It was no longer about style, about proving superiority through grace or form. It was about survival, about who could endure one heartbeat longer than the other. Yet within these brushes with death lay something hauntingly beautiful. In those moments, humanity was laid bare. Stripped of pretense, of wealth, of status, the duelists were reduced to their essence. Two mortal men, fragile and breakable, defying death with every stroke. The turning points revealed not just skill, but character. One fought with grim resolve, his every movement a testament to discipline even as his body failed him. The other fought with fiery defiance, refusing to let pain or exhaustion dim the blaze of his will. These qualities, more than their blades, defined the duel. The crowd knew this too. In their hearts, they felt the shifting tides, the perilous moments where destiny hovered just out of reach. Every gasp, every cry, every held breath was their way of sharing in the struggle. They were no longer mere observers. They were participants, carried along by the duel's rhythm, caught in its tide of peril and survival. And so, the duel continued, turning point after turning point, each one closer to the final end. It was as though death circled them, striking again and again, yet always pulling back at the last moment, leaving the men to stagger onward, battered but unbroken. The duel had become a crucible, a trial not just of skill but of spirit. Both men had already died a dozen deaths in the hearts of the watchers, yet still they lived, still they fought, still they defied the inevitability that loomed ever closer. By the time the last of these turning points passed, the field was stained dark with blood. Both men bore wounds that would have ended lesser fighters. Their chests heaved with the effort of breath, their arms shook with fatigue, yet their eyes never left one another. They had survived the impossible, endured the unbearable, and still the duel was not done. The turning points had come and gone, each one brushing close enough to steal hope, yet fate had chosen to wait a little longer. And now, with the balance teetering more precariously than ever, both men understood the truth. The duel could not continue much longer. Death had circled them long enough. Soon, it would strike for real. The turning points had shown how fragile life was, how narrow the margin between survival and destruction could be. But the final blow was still to come, and when it did, there would be no second chances. The storm was building toward its climax. The crowd braced, the duelists prepared, and history itself leaned forward. The turning points had passed, but the end had not yet come. That, and only that, remained. The duel had stretched far beyond what anyone expected. Both men, battered and blooded, had already endured more than seemed possible. The ground was marked by their struggle, footprints carved deep into the earth, streaks of crimson staining the soil, and the scent of sweat and iron hanging in the still air. Every turning point had carried them closer to this moment, and now, with the crowd silent and tense, the inevitable could no longer be delayed. The fatal blow was coming. It began not with a strike, but with a silence. After the last furious exchange, both men stepped back, circling slowly, their swords still raised but their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, loud enough for all to hear. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, fell into hushed stillness. No one dared move, as if even the sound of shifting feet might tip the scales of fate. It was a silence heavier than any noise, filled with the weight of impending death. One duelist, the younger of the two, blinked sweat from his eyes and tightened his grip. He was wounded, his left arm cut, his ribs aching from a slash that had nearly broken him, but his spirit still burned. Across from him, his opponent stood like a stone carved by time, older, slower perhaps, but unyielding. His blood dripped steadily from a cut on his thigh, each drop a reminder that he too was mortal, that he too could fall. Their eyes met, and in that look each saw the truth. Only one of them would leave this ground alive. The first move came suddenly, a surge of desperate will that shattered the stillness. The younger man lunged, his sword driving forward in a thrust meant to pierce the chest. It was fast, fueled by the last reserves of strength, but desperation makes even speed predictable. The older fighter twisted just enough, parrying with a sweep that sent sparks flying as steel clashed against steel. The deflection nearly threw the younger man off balance, but he recovered instantly, spinning into a slash aimed at the neck. The crowd gasped, believing they were about to see the end. But once again, the older man's blade rose, catching the strike with a shriek of metal. The two locked swords, faces close, sweat dripping from their brows, teeth gritted as they pushed against one another. Muscles quivered, breath hissed, and the very air between them seemed to vibrate with strain. For a moment, it appeared as though the stalemate would drag on, neither willing to yield, both too stubborn to collapse. But then, with a roar, the older duelist shoved, breaking the lock, and both staggered backward. It was then that the fatal sequence began. The younger fighter, reckless with frustration, struck out again. His blows came harder, faster, each one fueled by the need to finish the fight before his failing body betrayed him. His opponent gave ground slowly, deflecting, turning, conserving his strength with every movement. The crowd, leaning forward, sensed the shift. It was no longer a contest of equals. The younger man was burning himself out, while the elder was waiting, calculating, watching for the one mistake that would end everything. And then, it happened. As the younger duelist raised his sword for a downward strike, his wounded ribs betrayed him. Pain lanced through his side, slowing his swing by the smallest fraction. It was enough. The older fighter saw the opening, and in that instant, instinct and training fused into one perfect strike. His blade shot forward like a serpent, straight and true, slipping past the faltering guard. The sound was sickening, unmistakable, the wet, heavy impact of steel-piercing flesh. The younger man gasped, eyes widening as the blade drove into his chest. His sword, halfway through its arc, faltered and fell from his grip, clattering uselessly to the ground. His body shuddered violently, breath catching as blood filled his lungs. The world seemed to freeze, every sound swallowed by the horror of the moment. The fatal blow had landed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The older duelist's face was grim, his jaw clenched as he felt the resistance of bone and flesh around his weapon. The younger man's eyes darted wildly, as if searching for escape, for some way to deny the inevitability now coursing through him. But there was none. Slowly, painfully, he reached out with trembling fingers, pressing against his opponent's shoulder as though to hold himself upright. His lips moved, perhaps forming words, but no sound came, only a weak gasp drowned by the blood rising in his throat. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in cries of anguish and awe. Some turned away, unable to witness the brutal finality. Others clutched at one another, overcome by the raw intensity of what they had just seen. Parents shielded the eyes of their children. Priests muttered hurried prayers. A noblewoman fainted. The duel had ended in the only way it ever could, with death. The older duelist slowly withdrew his blade, the motion deliberate, heavy with the weight of what had been done. As the steel slid free, the younger man collapsed to his knees, blood pouring from the wound. For a fleeting instant, he remained upright, swaying like a reed in the wind. Then, with a soft, broken sigh, he fell forward onto the ground, his face pressed into the dirt he would never rise from again. His blood spread outward, soaking the soil, mingling with the stains already left by the battle. The silence that followed was suffocating. The crowd, moments ago roaring with emotion, now stood frozen, as though time itself had stopped. The victor lowered his weapon, staring down at the fallen figure with eyes that held no triumph. Victory in such a duel was not glory, but burden. He had lived, yes, but at the cost of taking another life. The knowledge of that truth weighed heavier than any sword. And yet, for all its horror, the moment carried a strange majesty. It was not only an end, but a beginning. With the fall of the younger fighter, history itself shifted. His death would ripple outward through families, through politics, through nations. His name would become a story, his defeat a symbol. The duel was not just the clash of two men, but the turning of an age written in crimson ink upon the soil. The crowd began to stir, whispers spreading like wind through the assembly. Some spoke of the younger man's bravery, of how he had fought beyond endurance. Others praised the older duelist's mastery, his ability to remain calm and strike with perfect precision. But beneath it all lay the undeniable truth. They had all witnessed something unforgettable, something that would be told and retold long after they themselves were gone. The victor at last turned away, his shoulders heavy, his sword hanging low at his side. Each step he took was slow, as though the ground itself resisted his departure. He had won, yes, but there was no joy in it. Only the weight of survival, the shadow of death following close behind. For in such duels, no one truly emerged unscathed. One died in body, the other in spirit. The body of the fallen duelist lay still, his blood pooling until the earth itself seemed to drink it in. His sword remained where it had fallen, glinting faintly in the fading light. It would never be raised again. His silence was final, absolute, echoing louder than any battle cry. He had lived fiercely, fought bravely, and died violently, his fate sealed by a single blow. The crowd, slowly dispersing, carried the memory with them. Each person knew they had been marked by what they had seen. Some would dream of it, haunted by the sound of steel and the sight of blood. Others would speak of it in taverns and halls, shaping the story into legend. But for all, the image of the fatal blow, the exact instant when history turned red, would never fade. The field that had only moments ago echoed with the clash of steel now stood in haunting stillness. Where once there was fury, now there was silence, thick and suffocating. The crowd, hundreds of witnesses who had held their breath with every strike, no longer shouted or gasped. Instead, they stared in stunned disbelief at the lifeless body stretched upon the blood-soaked ground. It was the silence of recognition, the silence that follows catastrophe, when the human mind struggles to grasp what it has just seen. The victor stood still, sword lowered, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. He was alive, but he looked less like a man who had won and more like one condemned. His eyes, unblinking, rested on the fallen figure before him. Blood still dripped from the tip of his blade, pattering onto the earth in small, steady drops. Each drop sounded louder than thunder to those who listened, as though the very world sought to remind them of the price of pride and honor. The body of the fallen lay twisted, his hand still reaching faintly toward the weapon that had slipped from his grasp. The earth beneath him had turned dark, a crimson pool spreading slowly outward like ink on parchment. His face was frozen in its final expression, a mixture of defiance and disbelief, as though his spirit had not yet accepted the reality of its end. Around him, the air hung heavy with the scent of iron, sharp and bitter, clinging to the lungs of all who breathed it in. The spectators began to stir. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others remained transfixed, their eyes wide, their lips whispering prayers or fragments of half-formed words. A woman sobbed quietly, her hand pressed to her mouth. A man shook his head again and again, muttering that he would never forget this day. And though they had gathered for spectacle, for justice or vengeance or curiosity, none had expected the sheer weight of witnessing life extinguished before their eyes. The duel had promised drama. It had delivered tragedy. The seconds of the fallen duelist stepped forward first. Their roles, so ceremonial at the beginning, were now grim and heavy. They knelt beside their master, pressing hands to his wounds though they knew the effort was useless. His blood was already slowing, the warmth fading from his flesh. One of them closed his eyes gently, murmuring a final prayer. Another picked up his sword from where it had fallen, holding it with reverence as though it were a relic. It was no longer merely steel, it was the last extension of a man's will, now stilled forever. Across the field, the seconds of the victor approached him with hesitant steps. They offered words meant to soothe, but he did not answer. He could not. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the moment of the strike, replaying again and again the instant his blade had pierced flesh. He had fought for his honor, and by the code of their world, he had won. Yet victory felt like ash on his tongue. The duel had ended as it was meant to, but in its ending, it had stripped him of something he could never reclaim. Slowly, the crowd began to leave. No trumpet sounded, no declaration rang out. They departed quietly, as though leaving a sacred place. Feet shuffled, cloaks rustled, whispers floated into the morning air. But the silence lingered, following them as they went. Each person carried a piece of what they had seen, etched into memory, impossible to erase. Taverns would echo with their retellings, and yet none of them could truly capture the oppressive stillness that had fallen after the storm of combat. Only those present could ever understand how heavy that silence had been. The victor finally moved. With deliberate slowness, he lowered his sword fully, letting its point rest upon the ground. His arm trembled, not with weakness, but with the immense weight of what it bore. For a long moment, he simply stood, head bowed, as though asking forgiveness from the earth itself. Then, without a word, he turned away. Each step he took was heavy, dragging, as if the soil beneath him clung to his boots, unwilling to let him go. Behind him, the body remained, guarded by loyal companions who would bear him away. They would prepare him with care, dressing him in dignity, so that even in death his honor remained intact. But no preparation could wash away the memory of the moment when his life had ended. That moment would endure, a wound upon the collective memory of all who had watched. And so the duel's aftermath stretched beyond the field. It stretched into the hearts of the witnesses, into the halls where stories would be told, into the chronicles where history would be written. The silence that followed the fatal blow was not empty, it was filled with meaning. It spoke of pride and its price, of courage and its limits, of honor and its terrible demands. It was the silence of realization, the silence of a world reminded that death comes swiftly, without poetry, without mercy. When at last the sun rose higher, the light fell full upon the field. It revealed the trampled ground, the bloodstains that no breeze could erase, and the faces of those who lingered, still unwilling to leave. The duel was over, but its echo would not fade. For long after the swords had been sheathed and the bodies carried away, the silence remained, deep, unyielding, eternal. The blood had dried, the echoes had faded, and the silence that followed the storm had become memory. Yet the duel did not end on that field. What had begun as a clash between two men soon transcended them both. The fatal blow, the stillness afterward, the heavy air filled with grief and awe, all of it became seed for a legacy far greater than the duelists themselves. Death may have claimed one, and burden may have scarred the other, but history ensured that neither was forgotten. The duel was reborn in the retellings, reshaped in the whispers, and enshrined in the annals of legend. At first, the story spread through the witnesses who had stood frozen on the blood-stained ground. They carried it home in trembling voices, describing not only the strikes and the wounds but also the weight of the silence that had fallen. To family, to neighbors, to strangers at taverns, they painted the scene as vividly as memory would allow. Some embellished the moment of the fatal blow, exaggerating its swiftness or the agony of the fallen. Others focused on the stillness afterward, claiming that nature itself had paused to bear witness. Each retelling grew slightly different, shaped by the teller's heart, until the duel lived not as one truth, but as many. Soon the duel's tale no longer belonged to those who had seen it. Poets took up the story, weaving it into verse that transformed the bloody clash into tragedy. Artists sketched the scene of two warriors locked in combat, their swords flashing like lightning under a storm-filled sky, though in truth the day had been clear. Chroniclers wrote with careful ink, setting down names, dates, and places, anchoring the duel into the framework of history. Between poet, painter, and historian, the duel became both fact and fable, fixed in time, yet timeless in meaning. But why did this duel in particular linger when countless others faded into obscurity? The answer lies in the intensity of its contrasts. It was not simply a fight, it was a theater of extremes. Youth against age. Reckless fire against tempered patience. Pride's desperate fury against honor's steady hand. The outcome carried more than blood, it carried a message. To some, it warned of the danger of unchecked passion. To others, it spoke of the burden of survival, the hollowness of victory. And to all, it revealed the fragility of human life when measured against steel and pride. The victor, though he lived, bore scars invisible yet profound. Accounts tell of how he withdrew from public life in the years following the duel. Where once he had been known for his boldness and sharp tongue, he became quieter, slower to anger, less eager for conflict. Some called it wisdom, the tempering of age. Others whispered that it was guilt, the shadow of that morning forever darkening his heart. Whether wisdom or guilt, his change itself became part of the legacy. He was remembered not only as the man who survived but as the man who learned the heavy cost of survival. The fallen, meanwhile, was immortalized in the opposite way. Though he had died, his youth, his defiance, and his unyielding spirit became symbols of tragic bravery. Songs called him noble, fearless, almost heroic in his refusal to yield even when wounded. His death was reframed not as failure, but as sacrifice, the kind of fiery end that gives rise to martyrs and legends. In this way, both men, victor and victim, were bound together in history. One represented the bitter truth of endurance, the other the eternal fire of passion extinguished too soon. As generations passed, the duel story was retold again and again. With each century, it changed. Tonight's, it was a lesson in chivalry and the seriousness of honor. To common folk, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and vengeance. To philosophers, it raised questions about justice, morality, and whether honor is worth the cost of human life. And to rulers, it was both a warning and a tool, evidence of how personal conflicts could ripple outward, shaping the memory of an entire people. The duel also influenced law and culture. In some places, it became a turning point in the debate over dueling itself. Was it justice, Or was it barbarism cloaked in ritual? For centuries, duels had been tolerated, even celebrated, as a way to resolve disputes when courts or kings seemed too distant. But this duel, with its sheer ferocity and unforgettable outcome, forced many to reconsider. Some rulers cited it as proof that dueling led only to tragedy, and laws were tightened to suppress such combats. Others, however, used it to reinforce the idea that honor required blood, that men must be willing to defend their names at the edge of a blade. In both directions, the duel's memory became part of larger currents in society. And then came the storytellers of later ages, who saw in the duel not only history but metaphor. To them, the clash of swords represented more than two men. It was life against death, pride against humility, rage against patience. They wrote of it as though the duelists were symbols of the human condition itself, locked in eternal struggle. Thus, what began as a personal dispute grew into something far greater, a parable of existence woven into the shared memory of humanity. Even today, echoes of that duel remain. In books, films, and theatre, scenes of fateful duels often draw unconsciously from this ancient story. The slow circling, the silence before the strike, the fatal blow that changes everything, these motifs carry the weight of that morning. And in our own lives, though we no longer settle grievances with swords, the themes endure. The clash between pride and humility, between passion and restraint, still plays out in countless ways, in conflicts large and small. The duel remains not just a piece of history, but a mirror of the human heart. As centuries passed, the blood on that field faded, washed away by rain, buried beneath the soil, yet the duel itself never disappeared. It remained not in the ground, but in the minds of people, in the stories whispered across taverns, written in chronicles, painted in ballads, and remembered in silence. The duel was no longer just a memory of two men and their pride, it had become something far larger. It became a mirror, a reflection not only of violence, but of humanity itself. To reflect upon the duel is to reflect upon ourselves, for in its ritual, in its passion, and in its tragedy, we glimpse the nature of what it means to be human. What does a duel reveal first and foremost? It reveals our relentless hunger for honor. For as long as humanity has walked the earth, reputation has carried weight heavier than gold. To be respected, to be seen as courageous, to be remembered as one who would not bow, these have driven men and women to risk everything. The duel is an extreme expression of that hunger. Two men meeting in combat, ready to spill blood, not for riches or territory, but for the fragile and invisible currency of reputation. It shows us how deeply we value the image we cast in the eyes of others, sometimes more than life itself. But beneath that quest for honor lies another truth. The duel exposes our fear of humiliation. Often, what drove men to such battles was not pride alone, but terror of disgrace. A word spoken in insult, a rumor left unanswered, an accusation unanswered in public, all these could eat away at the soul more painfully than any wound. The duel, then, was not only about glory, but about escaping shame. It is a stark reminder of how much power lies not in swords, but in words, and how fragile our egos can be when tested by them. The duel also reflects humanity's attempt to impose order upon chaos. Violence, in its raw form, is wild and unpredictable. Yet through the ritual of dueling, societies sought to frame it within boundaries, rules, witnesses, measured steps, agreed-upon terms. By cloaking violence in ceremony, men tried to tame it, to give it meaning. It is one of our oldest instincts, to take the chaos of existence and give it structure. But the duel reminds us of the limits of that instinct. No matter how carefully planned, no matter how beautifully choreographed, the end is still the same: flesh torn, blood spilled, life ended. It shows that though we crave order, death itself is the final chaos, impossible to civilize. There is also, within the duel, the eternal struggle between passion and reason. One man may burn with fury, throwing himself into reckless attacks, while the other waits, patient and calm, striking at the perfect moment. Both are human. Both are reflections of the ways we confront conflict in life. Some of us rush in, desperate to prove ourselves, while others bide their time, enduring, calculating, until the chance for resolution arrives. The duel is not merely two swords clashing, It is the eternal drama of human nature, acted out in the sharpest and most dangerous of theaters. And then there is courage. The duel, for all its flaws, lays bare the pure essence of bravery. To step forward onto that field, knowing that one misstep could mean death, required a resolve that few in any age could muster. Courage, however, is never pure. It comes mingled with pride, with anger, with desperation. Yet it is courage nonetheless. To face death openly, not in the chaos of battle where armies surround you, but in the focused silence of a duel where all eyes rest upon you, that is courage stripped bare. It is the kind of courage that terrifies and fascinates in equal measure, for it asks, would we, in their place, dare the same? Beyond courage, the duel also exposes the futility of vengeance. How many lives were ended not because of great wars, not because of noble causes, but because of slights that might have been forgotten with time? History is heavy with graves dug by pride. The duel teaches us this harsh truth, that vengeance, though it promises satisfaction, often delivers only emptiness. The victor walks away alive but burdened, the loser lies still forever. No true peace comes of it, only silence, only shadows that stretch forward into the future. Humanity, in reflecting upon duels, sees its own tendency to chase satisfaction in places where satisfaction cannot be found. The duel also forces us to confront mortality in its rawest form. Death is always near us, but we hide it behind closed doors, behind rituals of burial, behind the slow passage of age. In a duel, death stands in the open, unveiled, undeniable. It arrives swiftly, publicly, and decisively. There is no disguising it, no delaying it, no softening its edge. To witness a duel was to be reminded that life is fragile, that every heartbeat could be the last. For many who watched, this reminder shaped their thoughts for years afterward, changing how they lived, how they spoke, how they valued the time that remained to them. In this sense, duels were not only about death, they were about teaching the living how precious life is. And yet, for all the blood and sorrow, duels also reveal humanity's longing for meaning. People flocked to watch, not only for spectacle, but for story. They wanted to see justice enacted, honor defended, courage displayed. They wanted to believe that life's conflicts could be resolved cleanly, decisively, through ritual combat. In truth, life is never so simple. Yet the duel allowed them to imagine it was. In the clash of two swords, they sought clarity in a world too often clouded with uncertainty. Across time, the duel also reflects the way we change, as societies and as people. In some ages, duels were celebrated, their participants honored as paragons of courage. In others, they were condemned, outlawed as barbaric relics. This shift itself speaks to humanity's journey, from a world that saw honor as worth dying for, to one that increasingly sees life itself as the greater treasure. Reflecting on duels allows us to measure how far we have traveled, and how our values continue to evolve. But perhaps the most haunting reflection is this, that though we no longer fight duels with swords, the essence of them remains alive. We duel in words, in politics, in business, in private quarrels. We may not draw steel, but we still circle each other, still strike for pride, still fear humiliation, still crave victory. The duel lives on within us, transformed into new forms, reminding us that the battlefields of honor and pride are not confined to the past. They are part of the eternal fabric of human nature. And so, the duel across time is more than history. It is reflection. It is revelation. It tells us who we were, but also who we are. It holds a mirror to the heart, showing us the glory we seek, the fears we harbor, the mistakes we repeat, and the courage we sometimes find. It is a story not only of swords, but of souls. To study it is to learn not only about those who fought, but about all of us, about the fragile, complex, ever-contradictory nature of being human. And perhaps that is why the story of the bloodiest duel, and of all duels, still lingers in our imaginations. It is not simply about history, it is about us. Even though centuries have passed since swords clashed in the name of honor, the duel has never truly left us. Its form may have changed, its rituals may have softened, but its spirit continues to echo through our culture. In books, in films, in music, and in our collective imagination, the duel remains alive. Humanity, it seems, cannot let go of this image. Two figures standing apart, eyes locked, the air heavy with silence, and destiny hanging in the balance. The fascination endures because the duel speaks to something timeless, something deep within the human condition. In literature, the duel has long served as a stage upon which the greatest dramas of character unfold. From the novels of Alexandre Dumas, where musketeers and noblemen settled matters with the sharp edge of a blade, to the works of Russian masters like Pushkin and Lermontov, who themselves met their ends in duels, the motif carries an almost mythic weight. The written duel is not merely about violence, it is about ideals, about love betrayed, friendships tested, loyalties broken. Readers are drawn into these pages because they recognize the duel as the ultimate test of a person's soul. Stripped of armies, stripped of allies, the duel leaves only the individual to prove themselves. That idea continues to resonate, even in our age of vast, impersonal conflicts. Cinema, too, has embraced the duel as one of its most enduring images. Western films are perhaps the clearest example, where dusty main streets set the stage for gunslingers to face one another at high noon. These moments capture not only action, but ritual, the slow draw, the narrowed eyes, the inevitability of one falling and one walking away. Audiences hold their breath, not because they doubt the outcome, but because they yearn for the drama of resolution. Even in science fiction, the duel appears again and again, lightsabers clashing in galaxies far away, echoing the same symbolic patterns as steel swords centuries before. The weapons change, the settings change, but the fascination remains. The duel offers clarity in a world where conflicts are otherwise too vast, too complicated, too messy. Two figures, one outcome. Simplicity wrapped in tension. The world of music and theatre has not been untouched either. Operas of the 18th and 19th centuries often climax with a duel, voices soaring with passion as swords clashed upon stage. Modern music, though less literal, still borrows the imagery. Rivalries in lyrics, battles in rap culture, the very notion of a battle of the bands, all of these draw from the duel structure, two sides facing each other, one seeking to outshine, outlast, and claim victory. The form has changed, yet the essence remains intact. Even in sports, echoes of the duel linger. Boxing, fencing, martial arts, tennis, even chess, all present themselves as modern, non-lethal duels. Two opponents, balanced by rules, facing one another in direct confrontation. The fascination audiences feel is not unlike that of the crowd who once gathered to witness swordsmen test their courage. We still crave the sight of competition distilled into its purest form, one against one, skill against skill, will against will. And though these contests no longer end in blood, they still awaken the same pulse of tension, the same release when victory is claimed. Why does the duel remain so magnetic to us? Perhaps because it is the clearest expression of conflict and resolution. Life, as we live it day by day, is tangled with complexities. Arguments linger, rivalries drag on, injustices remain unresolved. But in the duel, everything comes to a sharp and simple point. Two enter, one triumphs. Resolution is swift, decisive, and complete. Though we may no longer approve of dueling as practice, we are drawn to its finality as symbol. It is the story of conflict stripped to its essence, and stories, above all, hunger for endings. At the same time, our fascination also reveals our curiosity about courage. When we watch fictional duels, or even symbolic ones in modern culture, we cannot help but ask ourselves, would we have the strength to stand in their place? Could we walk forward into danger, knowing the risks, and still remain steady? The duel becomes not only a spectacle to watch, but a mirror held up to our own courage or our fears. It speaks to a longing deep within us to test ourselves, to measure our worth against another, to know what we are made of. Yet there is also a darker attraction. The duel allows us to flirt with death from a safe distance. When we watch a duel in a film or read of it in a book, we feel the pulse of danger without bearing its cost. It is the same fascination that draws us to tragedies, to stories of war, to tales of disaster. We are both repelled by and drawn to the edge of mortality. The duel is a controlled glimpse into that abyss, a chance to experience fear and suspense, yet walk away untouched. Moreover, duels persist in culture because they are metaphors for struggles far beyond the battlefield. Every great rivalry, whether in politics, business, or art, is framed as a duel. Two visions, two wills, two destinies, colliding until one prevails. The language of dueling infuses our speech, people face off, companies battle head-to-head, and leaders cross swords. We may no longer permit steel to decide outcomes, but we still think in the imagery of duels. It gives shape to competition, makes it dramatic, makes it human. The endurance of dueling imagery also shows how history becomes myth. The actual practice may have been brutal, senseless, and tragic, yet over time it has been romanticized. Pain has been replaced by poetry, blood by symbolism. Culture has taken what was once deadly and transformed it into art. This transformation allows us to keep the duel alive without needing to confront its horror directly. It is not the graves we remember, but the stories. And perhaps that is the most telling reason why duels fascinate us still. They are stories distilled into flesh and steel. A duel has all the elements of great narrative: two characters, a conflict, rising tension, a climax, and resolution. Every duel, whether in history or imagination, tells a complete tale in the span of minutes. In our age, where stories are the threads that bind cultures together, the duel will never fade. It has become not only part of our past, but part of the way we tell stories about ourselves. So, while the bloodiest duel belongs to history, the duel itself belongs to eternity. It is reborn again and again, in novels and films, in arenas and stages, in metaphors and memories. It endures because it speaks to us in a voice we cannot ignore, the voice of conflict, courage, mortality, and meaning. And as long as humanity seeks stories that reflect its deepest struggles, the duel will continue to fascinate, not as relic, but as living symbol. The field where the bloodiest duel was fought is silent now. The grass has grown back, the earth healed of its scars, and the cries of the dying have long since faded into the vast silence of time. Yet silence is deceptive. For though no sound remains, the duel still speaks. It speaks through the pages of history, through the stories we tell, and through the lessons we continue to draw from it. The men who fell that day may be forgotten as individuals, their names blurred by centuries, but the blood they spilled whispers still, reminding us of who we are, and of what we can become. The duel's enduring voice is not only about violence. It is about the human struggle for meaning. Why else would people risk everything for honor, for pride, for a moment of triumph that outlives them? To us now, such sacrifice may seem senseless, but within their world, it was a truth worth dying for. That tension between our judgment and their reality is what makes the duel still alive in our imagination. It forces us to ask difficult questions. What do we value most? What would we risk for our beliefs? What is worth more than life itself? The duel offers no easy answers, only the echo of men who once thought they had found them. As we reflect, we see the duel not only as history but as parable. It warns us of pride's destructive weight, of the futility of vengeance, of the fragility of peace. Yet it also illuminates courage, devotion, and the resilience of the human spirit. Within its contradictions lies its lasting power. The duel does not allow us to see humanity in black and white. It forces us into the shades of gray, where honor and folly, bravery and recklessness, life and death intertwine inseparably. The blood that was spilled continues to shape the way we think about conflict. Though we no longer meet with swords at dawn or pistols at 10 paces, the instinct to defend our pride, to challenge and to prove, remains alive in subtler forms. In politics, in rivalries, in battles of words and influence, we still duel. The forms have changed, but the spirit has not. That is why the duel continues to speak. It is not simply a story of the past, but of the present, of ourselves, and of the struggles we continue to live. Yet there is also hope in its voice. The very fact that dueling has faded from practice shows humanity's capacity to grow, to rise above cycles of blood and revenge. Where once steel was the measure of worth, now dialogue and law strive to take its place. The duel reminds us of where we have been, and of how far we have come. It warns us against returning to such brutal simplicity, even as it tempts us with its dramatic clarity. In the end, the duel is a reminder of mortality. It teaches us, as so many of history's stories do, that life is fragile and fleeting. The men who fought believed they would secure immortality through their courage, And in a way, they did. For centuries later, we still speak of them. But their true immortality lies not in victory or defeat, but in the lessons their story continues to offer. Their blood became more than tragedy, it became testimony. And so, as we close the tale of the bloodiest duel, we are left with more than history. We are left with reflection. The clash of blades has faded, but the questions it raised remain sharp. What does it mean to be honorable? How do we balance pride with wisdom? How do we confront mortality, and what do we wish to leave behind? These questions linger, softly but insistently, like voices carried by the wind across that quiet field. The duel's blood still speaks because it speaks of us. It reminds us of the passions that drive us, the flaws that blind us, the courage that inspires us, and the wisdom we must strive for. It speaks not in condemnation, nor in celebration, but in truth. And perhaps that is why, when all else fades, its story endures. The duel is over. The men are gone. The world has changed. But the echoes remain. The blood that once darkened the earth has dried, yet its voice carries on, whispering across centuries, remember, reflect, learn. And in that whisper lies the true immortality of the duel, the power not only to tell us what was, but to remind us of what we still are.